In this video, we look at using a MIDI device to control elements of a Max patch. By the end of this video, you should be able to understand how you can implement MIDI control into the sampling instrument that we've been building together so far in this video series. So, you might start by asking, well, what is MIDI? And that's a reasonable question. MIDI, the musical instrument digital interface, is a communications protocol that was created in the early 1980s as a way to connect synthesizers and computers and to communicate and control between them. So today we continue to use MIDI as a kind of standardized way of transmitting several parameters about a musical note, so pitch, velocity, duration, channel, a few other things, in a way that is device independent. So that means that basically they can be read by any MIDI compatible device, which is to say, a lot. So why is this important? Well, MIDI means that we can use something like this, or like this, or like this, to control things. A lot of things, almost anything. And we can control it in an instrument like our sampling instrument, something that we built ourselves. We can use hardware to control it. Okay, so here we are in a new blank Max patch. I'm going to kind of run you through some of the very basic MIDI objects in Max that we'll be using. Now, remember that whenever we do anything in Max, it's really helpful to know how to use the help and reference lookup tools. There is also the examples folders, but for our purposes here, the reference is really important because it has things like this, a basic MIDI tutorial, and that's something that you can run through. There's a tutorial patch that comes with it. It looks like this. And it will talk you through in a lot more detail than I can go into here a few kind of tips and techniques for getting started with MIDI. If we just search MIDI, we'll see that there's dozens of other MIDI tutorials and tutorials on how to use particular MIDI objects. So first things first, let's find out how we can get MIDI into our Max patch. So I'm going to create a new object. Now remember that we can do that up here in the toolbar, or I'm going to use the keyboard shortcut N to create a new object. I'm just going to call it MIDI in. So we have our first MIDI object in Max. Now if I want to find out a little bit more about what MIDI in does, remember, so Alt and double click, and that will pull up the help file. But for now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold Command on my Mac, and I'm going to double click it. And that's going to show us all of the kind of MIDI input ports on my computer. So I am using this as my controller. This is a Keith Macmillan Q Nexus, a little handy little keyboard. But if you're working on the keyboards at school or at home, you might be using something different. You might be using the base station, so this list might look a little different for you. Now, my IAC driver on my Mac is basically just set up to take all incoming MIDI. But if I wanted to listen to a particular thing, I could select, for instance, the Q Nexus, and that would only listen to things coming from the little keyboard. But as it stands, I'm going to just have this set on here. So, how do I go from this keyboard to getting something to light up in Max? Well, I'm going to use a different object for the time being, because we just want something very basic. We just want a note. So I'm going to type note in. Now, as ever in Max, we can find out a little bit more about the object by opening the reference, or we can kind of hover the mouse over the outlets and inlets and see what it's expecting. So the inlet is a port accept a message that sets the MIDI input. Now we've set our MIDI input here in the MIDI in, so we don't need to worry about it here. And on the output, we're getting pitch, we're getting velocity, and we're getting channel, MIDI channel. Now, for the time being, we're not going to worry too much about channels. That becomes important when you're using sort of multiple MIDI messages all flying around all over the place. For now, we're just going to mainly focus on pitch and velocity. So I'm going to create a couple of new numbers. They're going to be integers, so I can create them up here, or I can just use the I command. Oh, let's just add one for the channel anyway. So I'm going to just connect these here. So that's going to be pitch, that's going to be velocity, and that's going to be channel. So pitch, velocity, channel. So now when I play this keyboard, you shall see we're getting things show up. That's just so I can show you. There we go. So as you see, the pitch is staying the same, 60, but the velocity is changing. Now essentially 0 means 0 velocity, note is off, my finger is off the keyboard. Now when it's a number higher than that, so you see it's held, that's the kind of pressure or the keyboard velocity that it's picking up. So you'll see same pitch but different velocities as I press it at different sort of strengths, and then as I move around the pitch changes too. Now 53 is not a particularly musical number. It doesn't really mean a lot to us as musicians, but luckily the integer object in Max is smart enough to help us out here. So if I create another copy, you'll see just the same number. But what I can do is I can open the inspector window for this object, and we can change the display format. So at the moment it's an integer. We could also have it as a kind of hex digit or something else, but we could have MIDI. I'm going to choose MIDI C4 here, and now what we're getting is we're getting musical notes. See? It's basically telling us what the note is as a kind of musical recognizable note name. So 60 is the default, 60 is middle C, so C4 here, and we're kind of moving down in semitones as single digits. So 59 is B, and then we get A sharp or B flat, and then A, and so on. So they're the same thing. If you need to send something a MIDI kind of pitch, you're sending it a number. You're not sending it a name. So just keep that in mind, that you're working in MIDI numbers now. And we know that 60 is middle C. So we've got MIDI coming into our patch. How do we send MIDI out? Well, I'm going to use note out now, and that's gonna work a little bit differently. So in Max we can construct notes, we can make them. Now ultimately what that means is we're going to send it a message, and a message is a few bits of important information kind of wrapped together. So the first thing that the message is going to entail is going to be the pitch. So we know that 60 is middle C. And then it needs a velocity. Now, if you remember before, we talked about Max and MIDI data usually ranging from 0 to 127. So a value of about 100 is a pretty average velocity. So I'm going to send it that, and then we're going to send it a channel. I'm just going to say 0 for the time being. And now if I connect that here and send this message, you should hear a middle C. There we go. Now I could change that just so we can hear the difference. I could say go up and make this 75. A bit quieter and a higher pitch. There we go. Now, if I wanted to just hear the MIDI notes that I'm playing in, it's just a matter of connecting these things up. So the inlet on this note out object is pitch, velocity, and channel, which is what we're getting from the note in. So all I have to do is connect up these patches here, and you should hear. There we go. We're getting some signal kind of running through. Now, one of the interesting things about Max is obviously that now we've kind of like we've taken the lid off this. We've got access to the MIDI data. So what can we do with that? Well, remember that we're just working with numbers here. So let's say I'm just going to keep playing middle C. But what we can do now is we can use kind of mathematical operators to change things. So let's put it up an octave. Let's add 12 semitones to C to 60. Now it sounds an octave up. Let's go down 2 octaves, minus 24. Same pitch on the keyboard, but now we've manipulated it. So this gets interesting when, remember how before we were, we looked at the random object? Let's just say +0. And let's have a bang, and let's have a random. Ooh, I can't spell today. Random 12. So that's our kind of normal pitch, but then if we see if this works. Ah, cool. So I'm playing the same note. If you look at the note in value that we're getting, it's staying 60. I'm still playing middle C, but we're getting different notes now. As we change, we're kind of adding random numbers. Interesting. Okay, let's try something slightly different. Let's now use our random number generator to change the octave. So let's just say I'm going to move between, I'm going to generate numbers between 1 and 4 and use that to multiply it by 12 to get a kind of octave. You remember there's 12 semitones in the octave. Multiply it by 12 to get an offset. So now if I just press same again, middle C, you hear as we get those random numbers, we start to move between different octaves. Now we could play around with the MIDI signal all day, and it's very easy to do kind of interesting things. So for instance, this example here that I've just loaded up, I'm stacking notes on top of a root note. So 0, our root, plus 3 semitones, plus 7 semitones, and plus 12 semitones. So when I play just one root note, this middle C, I'm getting that minor chord built on top of it. So then we, play around and we get a kind of strange minor chords built off the root all the time without really having to do anything, just because everything is stacking on top of that root. But for our purposes now and for the assignment, we just need to know how we can use a MIDI keyboard or MIDI controller to trigger some samples, to playback samples, and then you'll also want to be using a kind of on-screen interface. So one of the simplest things that we can do, if I just make this slightly larger, is we can use one of Max's objects called the K slider. Now this is a really handy graphical interface of our keyboard, and you'll see as well that the notes, it takes MIDI note value received. So if I now play in on my MIDI keyboard, we see visual representation on the keyboard. So it's really handy. Also we can, if I just delete this for a minute just to show you that as I play, I'm not getting anything out, but we can use the K slider object as our tool instead of the keyboard. So while I play on the keyboard, we hear it come out, but now I'm just using the graphical interface. So I'm going to take it out of, I'm going to lock the patch. Now, why am I getting no sound here from this keyboard? Well, it's because our velocity is set to 0 all the time now. You know that when we play on the keyboard, the velocity goes up and goes back down very quickly. Just take a look. So if instead we're using the keyboard, we need a different way to kind of make our note rather than having to type in a static, because now we're not getting the note off. So what we can use here is the makenote object in Max. So here I've unplugged our note out from our note in. So now my keyboard is not doing anything. It's not hooked up to the K slider and it's not hooked up to the note out. Instead, I've got Max's makenote object, and what that's useful for is when we need to kind of artificially create a MIDI note, because what it's going to do is it's going to take a pitch and it's going to build a note on and a note off message depending on the duration that we give it. So as I start to type this make note object, you'll see we get some argument prompts. We get velocity and we get duration. So I'm going to just add the average velocity of 100, and I'm going to say that the duration of our note is 200 milliseconds. So now, whenever I click a note on this K slider, it's going to create a note on and a note off message for us. You hear the note end, so now I can just do something else. So we have two ways of getting MIDI notes in Max. We have note in, which is useful when we want to use a keyboard like this and play the input the data. And we have the make note object, which will allow us to kind of artificially construct a MIDI note, which is useful if we're maybe sequencing things or we're not using a kind of external hardware controller. Okay, now start thinking about triggering our samples in our sampling instrument. So this is the patch as we saw it in the last video. I've loaded in our sample up here, and it is just playing the cowbell sample from an 808 drum machine, so you can hear it here. Okay, and as we did in the last video, we set up 4 different players that were playing back at different speeds. So I've got quarter speed, half speed, 3/4 speed, and full speed. And we had these phasing metronomes, playing them at different speeds and panning them about. And we're getting these kind of interesting slow rhythms unfold, which is really nice. However, this is a sampling instrument. We're not thinking so much about sequencing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete our rather nice metronomes. And now we don't have anything to trigger our samples, except maybe just graphically. So how do we use our MIDI keyboard? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to bring back our note in object, and we're going to say, we're going to assign these samples to 4 notes. We have 4 notes, we're going to put them on 4 notes on the keyboard. So starting at middle C, I'm going to go C, C sharp, D, and D sharp. And those are going to equate to the 4 different samples that we have playing back here. So what we need to ask Max is we need to say, only play these samples if we're playing note 60, middle C, note 61, C sharp, 62, D, and 63, D sharp. So how do we do that? Well, we use the cell object, or select essentially. So what this object does is it says if the value that is coming into this object equals 60, output a bang. If it equals 61, output a bang to the second outlet. 62, third outlet. 63, fourth outlet. So what it's doing is it's giving you're giving it a list of values that you want to check for, and if any of those come up, it will output from the correct output. So we can see if we just hover over now, bang if input matches 60, bang if input matches 61. So what we would do is we would just link up that there, and then if I create a couple of bang objects and hook them up, you'll see that actually the cell object also gives us this interesting input if the input doesn't match. So if I were to play a keyboard, a key other than C to D, it would output it there rather than where we're headed. So for now, if I press C, you see a little bang. There we go. So all I'd have to do is hook these up to trigger our samples. But we're getting a strange effect. You can hear all of the samples are triggering twice. Listen carefully. Now, that's happening as I note on and note off. So this is tricky because our sampler thinks that note off is doing the same thing as note on. So how do we tell it otherwise? Well, luckily, there's a Max object for that. There's a lot of these Max objects, and the best way to find them, the best way to learn them, is to head over to the references, remember? So you pull up the reference for a Max object, and this little question mark up here in the top left will either open the reference, but it will also tell you other kind of related objects that you can look at. It's a really helpful way of learning your way around Max, because it can be overwhelming. There's a lot of things going on. So for now, we're going to use an object called strip note. Now, what strip note does, if we pull up the reference, it filters out note off messages, which is exactly what we want to do. The way that it does it is it takes any note that has a velocity of not 0. So we need to send it our pitch, and we need to send it our velocity. I can get rid of this now. And then we just need the pitch out. This other one is the velocity, but we don't need that because we're just triggering samples. We're not triggering them at a given velocity. So now, let's just clean this up a bit. When I press the keyboard, the note off messages will have been removed from our MIDI signal, and we should just get nice. You can see how this is a bit interesting when you have a kind of full range of a kit sample, which you could play rhythmically. Okay, two quick things about triggering MIDI notes in Max. These aren't necessarily part of your assignment, but these are just interesting things to think about when we're dealing with MIDI and Max. So here I've got one of our sample players, and I've put a little access point in the top where we can change the pitch. So 1 is our normal speed, and I can drag this down to lower the pitch, lower the speed. Now, could we use our MIDI keyboard to trigger this sample, but to tune it properly? So as we play along the keyboard, our sample plays back a semitone up, or however we play it. Yes, we can. So if I open this, we've got a little function here. So note in and strip note, as we just saw. And then I'm using this interesting little, it's kind of like a pre-packaged module in Max called transratio. We can actually open this up and you can see it. I don't want to go into the maths too much right now because it's a little bit complicated. It's to do with 12-tone equal temperament, but we don't really need to know about that for now. All that we need to know is that it will allow us to take our MIDI note and to express it as a tuning ratio relative to our kind of center point. So if I play C, which is 1, a semitone up from that, C sharp, is actually expressed as 1.059. Okay, so think about it like this. That's C, and an octave below is half of that, 0.5. So we have to divide that into 12 points. So I can go see? Okay, there's another way that Max can be quite helpful, and it can express our MIDI pitches as frequencies, which, if you remember way back to when we were dealing with, you know, sine tones and the harmonic series and things, that's how we think about kind of the spectrum. So we can use the M to F object, MIDI to frequency, to translate our MIDI notes, which remember we're using as we're expressing as integers. So let's just drag this over here. we can express it as a frequency. So I'm going to create a new floating point number. And this is going to be in hertz. So I'll just put that there. So we have 60 is 261.6 hertz. And as I tune that, we can hear it there. So one of the nice things that we could do is we could set up a cycle object. Remember, this is our sine tone. We could give it this frequency. And let's send it to, I'll just send it for right channel, and so I'm playing that in on my MIDI keyboard now. So we're translating not only the ratio to change our samples pitch, but we're also controlling the frequency in hertz of a sine wave oscillator. Okay, that's the video on MIDI and Max. There's quite a lot to work through there, so don't worry if it seems a little bit overwhelming at first. Just take your time and kind of work through it. And remember to refer back to the assignment brief to figure out exactly what it is that you need to do for your assessments. But everything that you need should be covered there. And remember, Max's help files, the references, and the tutorials, there are really excellent MIDI tutorials that will sort of step you through these things. They are your best friend here. So good luck, enjoy playing around with MIDI in Max.